Welcome. My name is Joe Dresden. I'm Senior Program Associate at the Kennan Institute. Thank you all for joining us today for today's talk, which honors the legacy of James Billington, highlighting the research of our 2021-2022 Billington Fellow Katherine Zubovich. The James H. Billington Fellowship was established in 2016 in tribute to the co-founder of the Kennan Institute, former director of the Wilson Center, and former Librarian of Congress, Dr. James Billington. He made enduring contributions to the field of Russian studies and in our nation's ability to understand and maintain bridges of dialogue with the Russian people. I would encourage all of you to stay up to date with the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, and our new Russian language blog, In Other Words. You can also subscribe to our podcast, Kennan X and the Russia File. We're just tuning to those wherever you catch your podcasts. And please do also visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on the Wilson Center website for the latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine and the ongoing war. If you have questions for our speaker today, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than raising your hand. We'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the event, and we will move to your questions following the presentation. So I will begin today by introducing our speaker, then giving her the opportunity to deliver her remarks before we turn to the questions. Dr. Katherine Zubovich is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Buffalo, SUNY. Her book, Moscow Monumental, Soviet Skyscrapers and Urban Life in Stalin's Capital, was published in 2021. From 2021 to 22, she was a James H. Billington Fellow here at the Kennan Institute, as I've mentioned. Her research is focused on the history of Soviet visual statistics and has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Stipend. So if you're wondering what the relevance is, imagine you are the new leader of the Soviet Union, and you have a vast population. You're governing the largest country on the planet, but few of your people can read. So how do you communicate your values, your goals, the important state information to your population? You do that through visuals. And Katherine's now going to tell us all about how that got done. Katherine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thanks so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen, and Joe, maybe you can. Okay, well, thank you so much to Joe and the other program staff and fellows at the Kennan Institute and at the Wilson Center more broadly. I had a wonderful time as the Billington Fellow last year, extremely productive. And I want to give a special thanks to my Kennan intern, Andrew Liflianchik, whose research for me this past spring was superb and has informed this talk in all kinds of ways. So thank you to Andrew. All right, so today I'll discuss my ongoing research on the production of quantitative or numerical graphics designed for a mass audience in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And specifically, I'll talk about the work of the Soviet Union's Institute of Pictorial Statistics, founded in 1931. And the Institute is known by its acronym Isostat. Now, although Isostat was established in 1931, I'd like to begin my talk today in the autumn of 1938. This was a time when the artists and statisticians who worked at the USSR's Institute of Pictorial Statistics, or Isostat, when they were busy preparing a new book for display at the 1939 New York World's Fair. The Soviet Institute of Pictorial Statistics, Isostat, was an office founded in Moscow in 1931 to visualize statistical data for a mass Soviet audience. And early on, Isostat's graphics celebrated Soviet economic development and growth. And in the Institute's early years, in the initial years, much of this imagery highlighted the strides made as a result of the first five-year plans. But really throughout the 1930s, Isostat played an important role in transforming Soviet statistics into propaganda that circulated on billboards and posters and in exhibitions, newspapers, and books like the one that you can see here. So in 1938, in preparing their book for the New York World's Fair, Isostat's staff were faced with the important task of broadcasting Soviet achievements globally. This wasn't an entirely new task for the Institute. Isostat had, since the early 1930s, published English and other foreign language editions of some of their Russian books and albums. In 1933, for example, French and English language books by Isostat were displayed by the Soviet delegation to the London Economic Conference. So as world leaders gathered in 1933, struggling to find common ground at this conference in this really turbulent moment, struggling to revive world trade and lift themselves out of depression, the Soviet delegation led by Maxim Litvinov showed up with colorful pictures, proof of its recent industrial and economic growth as a result of the first five-year plan of 1928 to 32. As the Soviet newspaper Izvestia put it in 1933 in its coverage of the London Economic Conference, attendees need only glance at the Isostat album on display to see what the USSR has achieved during this extended period of depression in the capitalist world. So Isostat staff had thought about international audiences before, but the New York World's Fair, which opened in Queens, New York in April 1939, it guaranteed a very large foreign audience for Isostat graphics, and it ensured an audience of ordinary Americans as well. Now, the overall theme of the 1939 World's Fair was building the world of tomorrow. And Isostat responded with an album full of infographics and charts explaining to viewers how the Soviet state was already structured, the strides that had already been made, the transformations to daily life already achieved in the country's first 2 decades. The message of this album was essentially that in the Soviet Union, the world of tomorrow is already here. The album was divided into 4 parts. There was one part on government structure of the USSR, another part on the economic structure and growth of the USSR, a third part on the increased economic and cultural levels of the Soviet population, and a fourth part dedicated to women in the Soviet Union. Now, we know from archival files relating to this book's production that initial plans called for a shorter book, but the publication grew to over 140 pages, with a final section added at the last minute on the reconstruction, the socialist reconstruction of Moscow. Now, as with all Isostat graphics, the album created for the 1939 New York World's Fair tells us a lot about how the Soviet state chose to represent itself. We can see here which elements of Soviet life were worth showcasing in 1939. Elements like sanatoriums and rest homes, elements like preschool institutions that had been set up for childcare, and of course, the growing number of women engineers and technical workers in large-scale industry, as the chart on the bottom left shows. Although designed for a foreign audience, Isostat's World's Fair book captures well how the Institute's graphics had evolved over the course of almost a decade. Central to Isostat's approach was that its artists drew on the so-called Vienna Method for visualizing statistics, and I'll come back to this in just a moment. But the album also made use of illustrations alongside some of its statistical graphics. This had become kind of a common thing in Isostat books later on in the 1930s. The book's creators interspersed quantitative imagery with photography and photo collage as well, and this was an established Soviet graphical convention by the late 1930s. We can see also in this album the prominent role played by Soviet avant-garde artists in Isostat's more high-profile work. L. Lizitsky was involved in the production of this album. Artists Alexander Rodchenko and Varvara Stepanova had been involved in the production of a book published in 1938 by Isostat. So the 1939 World's Fair album gives us a view into Isostat at about 8 or so years into the Institute's work in the sphere of visual statistics. This World's Fair album also, though, represents Isostat's activities at an especially difficult moment for the organization. Isostat was affected, as all Soviet institutions were, by the purges, or the Great Terror, which was underway at the time that this book was being produced. And we can see the terror reflected right on the first page of the book, if we know what to look for, in the list of editors of the album. Ivan Ivanitsky, listed here as the senior scientific collaborator, was an artist and longtime employee of Isostat, going back to the Institute's founding in 1931. But Ivan Sautin, head of the Soviet Union's Central Board of National Economic Statistics, he was new to his job as of January 1938, having replaced 2 predecessors, both of whom were purged in quick succession in 1937. Saoutin was not employed within Isostat. He oversaw the institute as part of a much larger portfolio that included many other more important things, like overseeing the administration of the Soviet census. Saoutin's predecessors had been purged in connection with the census carried out in 1937. That census was suppressed by party leaders unhappy with the results. The 1937 census that was counted in January of that year revealed that the Soviet population was about 162 million, not the 170 million expected. And this, of course, raised all kinds of difficult questions about trends in Soviet mortality rates since the last census of 1926. Now, Saoutin was not a statistician by training. He had no experience in this area of work. But as Isostat was busily working on the New York World's Fair album, Saoutin was himself preparing for a new census that was to be run and that would be run in January of 1939. As the Soviet state's premier institution tasked with visually representing Soviet statistical data, like that collected in the census, Isostat faced considerable challenges in this moment, and a number of Isostat staff were themselves purged during the terror. Now, it's worth noting that the USSR's Institute of Pictorial Statistics was really just one of many Soviet institutes tasked with creating exhibition materials for the New York World's Fair. Isostat is really part of a larger Soviet media landscape that emerged in the 1920s and 30s. This was as true at home as it was abroad, where Isostat sort of created imagery for audiences abroad and competed with other Soviet institutions, but also with other imagery. Same thing at home, lots of competition in that sort of media landscape. Nonetheless, Isostat's World's Fair book is an interesting lens through which we can view visual strategies used for audiences both at home and abroad. Strategies that, on the one hand, legitimized the Soviet state and its achievements in areas from industrialization to women's rights. But on the other hand, these were graphical strategies that obscured and silenced the demographic consequences of the economic and political policies of the Stalinist 1930s. So having looked a little bit at that 1939 New York World's Fair album, I'm now going to take us back to Isostat's founding in 1931 in order to discuss the origins of the Institute, as well as the international connections of the first five-year plan era that made the establishment of this institute possible in the first place, and that informed the Institute's first few years of activity. At the end of the talk, I'll then kind of move back into the mid and late 1930s once again to consider the very different global international context that began to shape Isostat's work in this later period. So I'll be charting kind of shifting graphical and propagandistic conventions, as well as changes in the Soviet Union's international engagement through the 1930s. Now, a good place to start when thinking about the history of Isostat and its work in the 1930s is simply to observe the importance of statistical graphics in many countries in the early 20th century, and in the Soviet Union in particular. Statistics as a scientific discipline arose in the 17th and 18th centuries in service largely of modern nation states. And as the field of statistics developed into the 19th century, quantitative graphics emerged as a means to better analyze data and to better communicate findings among experts. The second half of the 19th century saw so dramatic a rise in the production of quantified graphics that this period represents a golden age of data visualization. And alongside professional uses of statistical graphics, data visualization began moving into the popular arena at the turn of the 20th century. This was an area of visualization that was of great interest to the Soviet Union's new leaders. It's fair to say, I think, that diagrams, charts, and quantitative graphics proliferated more widely than ever before in the region of the former Russian Empire following the establishment of Soviet power. Soviet citizens quite simply spent time looking at diagrams displayed in public, like those that are pictured here. Countless photographs taken of early Soviet daily life document how ordinary people interacted with such imagery. In these photos, people are shown looking at information relating to agrarian work, and the photographers have chosen very deliberately to capture not the diagrams themselves, but the diagrams in action, so to speak, to document the act of looking. new Soviet graphics arranged and systematized knowledge in a purposeful and seemingly scientific manner. Quantified graphics in the early Soviet Union worked to guide the viewer in identifying their role in the larger systems taking shape around them and in making sense of their rapidly changing world. Now, of course, numerical graphics developed within the larger context of Soviet visual culture and propaganda, and scholars of early Soviet propaganda have noted the prominent role played by visual media in the first few decades of Soviet rule. So Victoria Bonnell, for example, in her book, Iconography of Power, writes about Soviet mass propaganda as having privileged the eye in the first decades after the revolution. More recently, scholarship by Sergei Ushakin discusses the new culture of the eye that emerged in the early USSR and the new optical regime that took hold in the first 15 years of Soviet power. So building on their work, I'm thinking about numerical graphics as an important segment of the larger pursuit of communicating ideas and knowledge through visual means. Given the early Soviet state's primary goals and challenges, it's no surprise that we can see in the Soviet Union's early decades a search for new ways to visualize numbers and the economy. With the adoption of the first five-year plan in 1928, the creation of clear and easily understood quantitative graphics became all the more important as a means to legitimize the state's goals, but also to teach numeracy. Literacy rates more generally rose quickly in the Soviet Union from the 1920s into the 1930s, but as historian Jeffrey Brooks shows, even as literacy increased, many words, phrases, and concepts important to Soviet leaders remained unintelligible to ordinary people. So Brooks finds in his research that Soviet propagandists were well aware that, quote, readers did not understand terms central to the Bolsheviks' message. Terms like democracy, imperialism, dialectic, class enemy, socialism, but also budget, deficit, balance. Developing numeracy would become a crucial priority in the early Soviet decades. When Isostat was created in 1931, the first five-year plan was still underway, and Soviet leaders faced major challenges in communicating the plan beyond planning offices. The first five-year plan was an overwhelmingly big plan to rapidly industrialize and collectivize the country. How do you convey the scale of such a plan? How do you make the plan graspable and understandable to a non-specialist, non-official audience? An audience of ordinary people who were likely to see in that plan something menacing and frightening, something illogical. And once the plan was, quote unquote, achieved, how do you communicate those achievements in a convincing way that sweeps aside the violence and chaos of reality to show instead the plan in its ideal form? And focusing on Isostat offers an opportunity to look at how the Stalinist state attempted to do this, and thereby to shore up legitimacy, but also to encourage Soviet citizens to see their world through a statistical lens or through the eyes of the planner. So it was in November 1931 that the Soviet Union's Institute of Pictorial Statistics, or Isostat, was founded, and the institute served initially to centralize existing trends in diagram and chart making. Isostat graphics were displayed on billboards, in window displays, in exhibitions, in books, and in newspapers. And Isostat artists and economists didn't just use any method for doing their work. Isostat was founded in 1931 with the very specific goal of bringing the so-called Vienna Method of picture statistics into the Soviet Union. Described as a picture Esperanto by the New York Times in 1933, the Vienna Method was invented in Red Vienna by the German philosopher and linguist Otto Neurath. Neurath had honed his method of data visualization in his Museum of Society and Economy, located in Vienna. And exhibitions there were geared towards the working class of Vienna. The idea was to move data beyond elite scientific discussions and into a sort of popular realm. In the late 1920s, Soviet embassy staff in Vienna learned about and grew very interested in Neurath's work. And also in this moment, Neurath himself was working to develop international interest in his new picture language that was being developed through the museum. Neurath had international ambitions for his method of visual statistics. Now, the historians Julia Kostenberger and Emma Mintz have documented in their work the connection that was forged in the early 1930s between Red Vienna and Red Moscow, a connection that led to an official Soviet invitation sent to Neurath in late 1931 to come to Moscow to help establish this new Institute of Visual Statistics there. In bringing Neurath's method to Moscow, Soviet officials hoped to transform an international language of graphic communication into a revolutionary tool of communist governance. Isostat's office, located not far from Red Square in central Moscow, quickly became a hub for Soviet experiments in data visualization. Soon, Soviet leaders would open additional branches of Isostat in the Soviet Ukrainian cities of Kharkiv, Kiev, and Dnipro. There were also plans to open branches of the Institute in Tashkent and Tiflis, though these seem not to have come to fruition. By the late 1920s, there were many approaches available to Soviet leaders who wished to visualize data. Soviet officials and managers could draw on long-standing Russian and Soviet traditions that long predated Neurath's model, or on competing international models. The Vienna method was just one approach to visual statistics among many that had emerged by the early 20th century. One approach that was out there was that of American engineer Willard C Brinton, whose hugely popular textbook, Graphic Methods for Presenting Facts, was translated into Russian in 1927. Originally published in English in 1914, Brinton's book catered to the businessman, the social worker, and the legislator, as he put it, who had no formal training in statistics or graphic methods, but who wished to present facts and data in more convincing ways. But Soviet officials specifically chose the Vienna method for their new institute and for their new endeavors moving into the 1930s, and they did so for a number of reasons. This method was appealing in part because of its internationalist claims, because it made claims to being more scientific than other methods, perhaps also because it was a team-based method that required the use of a group of people working together to achieve these graphics, the economist or the statistician on one side, the artist on the other, and in the center, a figure known as the transformer, whose job it was to translate the numerical into the artistic and to make all of those design decisions at the center. But most important was Vienna Method's goal of moving statistics into the popular realm. For Neurath, it was all about democratizing access to information. And Isostat's founders, Soviet founders, saw their work in a similar light. In creating their institute, they turned for inspiration not only to Neurath, but also to Vladimir Lenin, who articulated his own thoughts on the importance of popularizing statistics and spreading numeracy as early as 1918, as you can see in this quotation. Now, quite a bit of time had passed between 1918 and 1931. But this quote, in which Lenin calls for, wresting statistics away from the exclusive terrain of governing elites, where it remains in capitalist society, this quote, it comes up again and again in Isostat's founding documents. It provided a set of guiding ideas for the Institute. So Isostat drew on Bolshevik concepts, but also imported foreign techniques. From late 1931 until 1934, Otto Neurath and other instructors from Vienna spent time in Moscow and in Kharkiv training Isostat's Soviet staff. It's worth noting that the Vienna Method experts saw their work as international. For Neurath, the Vienna Method of visual statistics was international by its very nature. By this, he meant that the same graphics could be put into use globally, resulting in the very same message being conveyed to viewers around the world. Related to this, Neurath and his team of experts in Vienna maintained that visual statistical graphics required no training on the part of the viewer to decipher. As one of Neurath's staff, Maria Reidemeister, would later put it, the Vienna method does not ask for any training in the reader, only in the writer, who is one of very few. So in reproducing the same charts in both their sort of Russian language and English language books, Isostat staff put this principle into practice, or at least experimented with it in their early years. In bringing the Vienna Method to Moscow, Isostat staff proceeded down a fairly prescribed route in their efforts to visualize statistics. As Isostat staff would learn from their foreign instructors, a basic set of rules underlay Vienna Method work. The Vienna Method required the use of a symbol dictionary, a standardized set of icons, say for man or worker, that limited the imagery that could be used across different charts. While Neurath and his team were adamant that their method was always and already international, new symbols would of course become necessary as the Vienna Method expanded into the Soviet Union. As the German lithographer Gerd Arndt later recalled, the first new symbol created in Moscow was a tractor. The Vienna Method also took a different approach to visualization than one that was more commonly in use at the time. Rather than using differences in size to indicate different values, the Vienna Method repeated identical icons on the page. And we can see this difference in approach more clearly by comparing a late imperial era visualization to one that was produced by Isostat. So on the left of the page is an image from Russian bibliographer and writer Nikolai Rubakin's book, Russia in Numbers, Россия в цифрах. This book, published in 1912, aimed to familiarize Imperial Russian readers with the latest population statistics about their country. Rubakin's book was based on the results of the Russian Imperial Census conducted in 1897. And as the design historian Vladimir Lenin notes, the book serves as a really key example of the popularization of quantitative graphics in Russia during the late imperial period. Now, in Rubakin's view, graphics aided the reader to more fully understand the significance of the statistics collated in the text. Diagrams and images, Rubakin wrote, helped to clothe the dry numbers in flesh and blood. The images in Rubakin's book were designed to help readers draw firmer conclusions about the meaning of the data relayed in the adjoining text. And to this end, the artist hired by Rubakin employed a visual technique that future proponents of the Vienna Method would come to see as deeply flawed. The image on the left compares the population of Russia's service estate to that of the country's peasantry. The figure of the peasant is drawn as many times larger than the figure of the bureaucrat, though how many times larger precisely is hard to gauge. And as striking as Rubakin's pictures are, no concrete numerical conclusions can be drawn from them. So in pursuit of greater scientific accuracy, the Vienna Method called on the artist to forego this kind of scaling technique and to instead use identically sized archetypes, like the ones you can see repeated on the page on the right, to signify a common numerical value. I'll show you this image also in the Russian language version of the same graphic. This ensured Vienna Method proponents argued that more precise meanings could be arrived at by the viewer. Now, by the mid-1930s, the Vienna Method would be renamed Isotype, an international system of typographic picture education. Isotype would have a long and international life beyond the Soviet Union, and there is an enormous scholarship on Isotype's history and global spread in the 20th century. In the early 1930s, however, as the Vienna Method was making its way to Moscow, the method was still in its infancy. Otto Neurath's arrival in Moscow in late 1931 was not the first time that the Vienna Method was used in the Soviet Union. Before Neurath and his staff from Vienna came to Moscow, Soviet artist Ivan Ivanitsky experimented with the Vienna Method in his work at the Leningrad Office of Pictorial Statistics, an office that predates Isostat, based down in Moscow. Ivanitsky would be hired down in Moscow as soon as Isostat was set up, but before this, he was working up in Leningrad on this collection of images in his Catch Up and Overtake postcard series. The collection consisted of 70 postcards published in 1931 that visualized advances in a range of Soviet industries and compared growth in the Soviet Union's first decade with that in Europe and America. Ivanitsky's postcard collection had an initial print run of 20,000 copies, and it was available for purchase in Soviet bookstores. It was also advertised widely in newspapers, pitched in those ads to potential buyers working in Soviet factories and planning offices, schools, and workers' clubs who needed ready-made diagrams to illustrate lectures or simply to spread numeracy among their workforce. Each card is designed with circulation in mind. So the back of each card has what you would see on the back of a postcard, places for an address and a place to write a message. Once in circulation, Ivanitsky's images promise to help viewers to master numerical figures, as the advertisement for the collection in the railway workers' newspaper, Gudok, proclaimed. Now, the Library of Congress has a copy of this series, which is what I photographed for you here. You can see here that to depict the growth of the Soviet Union's working class between 1927 and 31, Ivanitsky used on the left as his archetype a worker pictured in profile with a sledgehammer thrown over one shoulder. Each worker in Ivanitsky's chart represents a unit of 2 million, so that by 1931, we see there were 16 million workers. Ivanitsky used a similar principle with railway cars instead of workers for his postcard comparing passenger traffic in 1930 on railways in US, in Germany, and in the USSR. In this image, however, each train car represents 7 billion passenger kilometers, which I think causes the viewer to work a bit harder to make numerical meaning of that image on the right. The ultimate message, however, that the USSR was ahead of both the US and Germany in passenger rail traffic in 1930 is immediately understood. The number of rail cars conveys this clearly, as do the triangle-shaped slices of ever denser crowds of people pictured above the 3 trains. We can get a sense of how top Soviet officials viewed Izostat's early work, as in these books here, in the Institute's archival records, which contain correspondence between those involved in founding and directing Izostat. A number of old Bolsheviks were involved in the creation of this institute. Avel Enukidze was involved, Lazar Kaganovich was involved, Nikolai Bukharin to some degree, although he seems to have sent his secretary for the most part to meetings in the founding of the institute. In April 1932, Lazar Kaganovich, who was most intensely involved in the founding of Izostat, he was sent samples of Izostat's early work, and he responded in writing after having looked over the charts that were sent to him. Now, I don't know what exactly he was sent, but I provide these images on the right here as examples. It's clear from the letter drafted by Kaganovich that he was not entirely satisfied with what he saw in those early samples of Izostat's graphics. He responded with some criticism while also articulating a broader vision as to the social and political function of Izostat graphics. Kaganovich's criticism was that greater care should be taken in the drawing of the figures so that, as he put it, the workers and peasants don't look like blockheads and the wagons of coal don't look like piles of manure. Kaganovich also offered some broader reflections. The ultimate goal, as he saw it, was for visual statistics to transform dry, boring statistical tables into lively images and powerful agitational, propagandistic, and pedagogical agents, end quote. For Kaganovich and other Soviet leaders, visual statistics would become part of a larger iconographic repertoire, a tool like the political poster that had the potential to reach across the vast and diverse Soviet space, nimbly traversing linguistic, cultural, and educational barriers with simple, easily understood imagery. For Kaganovich, the novelty of visual statistics lay in this medium's ability to convey complex, abstract statistical information in a form that could be readily understood in theory by any Soviet citizen. The abstraction of these images, I think, was key. Kaganovich was among those who oversaw collectivization, and he may well have enjoyed the comforting level of abstraction pictured before him on the page. Izostat charts swept aside the violence and pain of the USSR's path to industrialization to paint instead a neutral and depersonalized image of Soviet power. Where we see this prominently is in Izostat charts depicting collectivization. This page, published in a book of 1933 with a print run of 15,000, shows non-collectivized farmsteads in the illustrations along the top of the page. On the left there in the sort of gray-brown color, shows these non-collectivized farmsteads as fractured spaces that lack modern mechanization. The process of collectivization is pictured as a peaceful transfer from green to orange in a way that's hard to square with what we know about the famine and about the forcible deportation or special resettlement of almost 2 million peasants in 1930 and 1931. Isostat imagery highlighted key themes of the collectivization drive, such as agricultural mechanization, while softening and obscuring the social upheavals that characterized the era. In turning numbers into narrative, Isostat graphics obscured the individual stories and painful experiences that punctuate the Stalin era. And I'll share just a few others of these sort of visualizations of collectivization that kind of show you how this was done in a very sort of softened way. Now, Isostat graphics were a powerful technology of mass communication that swept aside the ambiguity and violence of Soviet power to show instead Soviet revolutionary development in its ideal form. Unlike the statistical data collected and used by the Soviet State Planning Agency, Isostat's images were representational objects meant to operate within a larger public sphere. The diagrams produced by the Institute capture on the page the Stalinist state's enthusiasm for the transformative power of quantification, as Arunabh Ghosh recently put it. And in moving numerical data beyond the state's planning offices and out into the popular realm, onto billboards and exhibitions and books, Isostat worked to guide Soviet citizens in seeing their world in the diagrammatic categories integral to Soviet state planning. Another image showing sort of liquidation of illiteracy here in a very different way, slightly more evocative, kind of more narrative way that Ivanitsky would kind of start to employ in his later imagery once the Vienna Method experts had left in 1934. So by 1939, Isostat had left behind the first 5-year plan. It started to create albums that were more thematic in content, like one on aviation, one catering to youth. The album on the bottom from 1936 is a kind of pocket-sized youth in numbers booklet that you could just kind of put in your pocket for handy reference. They started to create more artistic albums like this one, and especially like this one, Moscow Rebuilding, which drew on the work of Alexander Rodchenko and Varvara Stepanova. By early 1939, Isostat staff were working tirelessly to prepare that book for the New York World's Fair that I began with. The fair was set to open in April 1939, and on February 2nd, 1939, Ivan Sautin, head of the Central Administration of Economic Statistics of the USSR, Gosplan, wrote to the Soviet Energy Utility with the request that they allow Isostat to keep the lights on in their workshop day and night through the months of February and March 1939. Isostat staff at the time were completing work on the New York book, as well as visual materials for the 18th Party Congress, which was held in mid-March 1939. This was the event at which Stalin finally announced the result of the Soviet census, not the silent 1937 census, but the second census conducted in January 1939. The Soviet population, Stalin announced at the conference, was 170 million, still 10 million short of the number hoped for and projected. By April 1939, the official Soviet population figure had inched up to 170.5 million as it was adjusted. And this is the figure, as you can see here, that was used in Isostat's graphics thereafter. The New York World's Fair material was a major project, but the Institute had other projects planned for 1939 and 40 as well. And I'll tell you about them as I close. In addition to creating graphics for a foreign audience, the themes that Isostat worked on for Soviet audiences in 1939 were overwhelmingly global in content. And this is a reflection, of course, of the rapidly escalating international events of the late 1930s. In 1939, Isostat published a book, this one, titled The USSR and Capitalist Countries. It was published in Russian. This book, as originally envisioned, was to include a significant anti-fascist element with a section titled Fascism Prepares for War While the USSR Fights for Peace. That was the plan in early 1939. But this anti-fascist content does not appear in the final book, which is not surprising given its publication date of fall 1939, shortly after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. Germany is included in the book. As you can see here, it's kind of included in this list of capitalist countries on the right-hand side here, competing in the area of peat production. Germany is included, but it's included simply as a capitalist country. And Britain and France's imperialist war against Germany, as it was called, are also discussed as a major theme of this volume. Also present in the final book is visual treatment of a new theme: the Soviet annexation of Eastern Poland and the military buildup of the Soviet Union. On the left, you can see the strength of the Red Army versus Germany here in black and France here in gray. On the right are images of the Red Army liberating, quote unquote, Western Ukraine and Western Belarus from the Polish yoke. And of course, the word here that's used is pan, which is a derogatory slur used across Soviet propaganda of the period. Isostat's global mandate broadened in 1939 to also include visual aids for the International Red Aid Society. This was an international aid organization created in 1922 by the Comintern, a kind of communist analog to the Red Cross. I have no knowledge of whether those materials were actually created, but the main themes as planned in early 1939 were things like the USSR and capitalist encirclement, the fight of the Chinese nation against Japanese aggressors, and the heroic battle of the Spanish people against fascism. An exhibition and book that was created by Isostat artists in 1940 picked up on many of these same themes, with an emphasis on the coming war. The Defense of the USSR exhibition and companion book was published with a print run of over 15,000. It highlighted the Soviet military buildup with special emphasis on the Air Force. The companion book included a diagram showing how each of the images should be arranged in an exhibition so that identical exhibitions could be mounted at venues throughout the USSR. While most of the book detailed the development and growth of Soviet military technology and equipment, later pages highlighted recent events from 1939. And once again, the annexation of Eastern Poland was a theme developed through the inclusion of photography, not through visualized data. And you can see that here on the right with photographs that show Lviv on the bottom here, and people greeting the Red Army as liberators in the top image. So overall, Isostat's graphics served an important role in spreading and cultivating numeracy among the Soviet populace, while also communicating simple narratives about the USSR's economic growth and progress. In founding the Institute in 1931, Soviet officials were banking on the authority and legitimacy that could be gained by speaking through numbers. Now, in terms of broader takeaways, I think that this project has larger relevance beyond Soviet history. It speaks to how authoritarian states used and continue to use visual propaganda, a strategy for shoring up resilience and gaining legitimacy. The visual strategies that states choose to employ are, of course, not only an authoritarian concern. The history of Isostat, I believe, speaks to larger concerns relevant to our current visual age and to our new era of disinformation. Visual statistics are used to justify many global projects today, just as they were once used to celebrate Soviet communism in the 1930s. Thank you so much for your attention.
Catherine, thank you very much. That was some fascinating material in your discussion. I'm going to start right in with one of the questions from the audience, and then I'll have some comments of my own. Somebody asked, Adrian Sudalter asked, you mentioned that one of the works that you showed was in the Library of Congress. Is there an Isostat archive in Russia where much of this material survives, or are there other archives where it might survive?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that question. So the Library of Congress did collect many of these books, which was a big treat for me being in DC last year to reference all of them. There is no Isostat archive that I know of in Russia, although I'd be curious to learn of one. The National Russian library, the Lenin Library, does have a large collection of these books in its graphical office. There is also a large collection of Neurath's work that includes material related to their work in Moscow at the University of Reading in the UK. But most of the materials that I've found having to do with this are in the economic archive in Moscow, in the files of Gosplan, in the state planning agency files. So there isn't a kind of central location, but if you were to look for them, that would be where to go.
Great. A question I had is, the guy from Vienna did not bring socialist realism to the project of visual representation. So can you discuss a little bit about how that type of influence came to be in Isotop's work?
Sure. Yeah, I think Isotop's so interesting because we can see in these graphics in part sort of the continuation of a lot of modernist avant-garde graphical trends into the 1930s. On the other hand, we also clearly see a really strong influence of socialist realism here. And Emma Mintz had, in her work on Isostat and on that relationship between Neurath and the office, has really beautifully discussed this kind of, the tensions that emerged as a result of the, socialist realism coming onto the scene in 1932, 1933. The Vienna Method experts had real problems with the kinds of illustrations that Soviet artists and Soviet officials wished to see around those visualizations of just data. And there were all kinds of sort of tensions that emerged as a result of those issues of wanting to have kind of more emotional, more evocative imagery than just the sort of scientific kind of pure data being conveyed in as simple a means as possible. So yeah, the tensions of socialist realism are very real.
Okay. We have a question from Peter Rutland, who compliments you on your work. So glad to see it being done, but ask whether Isotop produced what are called magic lantern slides for educational purposes.
I haven't, thanks so much, Peter, for that question. I haven't seen any evidence that Isostat used magic lantern slides, but we know that Neurath did. And when they were working in Moscow, Neurath was doing all kinds of international work in that moment as well. He was over in New York, and there's a wonderful New York Times article about his presentation through magic lantern slides of this sort of work to an American audience. And so, but I haven't seen that in the archival materials or in any of the materials yet, but I'll keep an eye out for it. Thank you.
Okay. We have about 10 minutes remaining in today's discussion, so and plenty of questions in the queue, so apologies in advance if I don't get to your question. So next question comes from Zuri Franklin, asking whether you would say that these visual graphics increased nationalism or were a way for the USSR to boast about achievements to other countries. How do these graphics intertwine with Soviet internationalism and Soviet realism?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Sorry. Yes, whether they increase nationalism. I would say so. One of the things I'm trying to tease out in my research now on the Institute is whether these visualizations are cultivating a sort of Soviet identity, or whether they are, we clearly start to see more national themes moving into the late 1930s. That is, like Soviet nationality themes moving into the late 1930s. And so whether there's a kind of Soviet identity that's coming through in these images, or whether there are, individual concerns of nationalities coming through here is a really interesting question, I think. Where I would love to get this information is through those, the Ukrainian branches of the Institute. And thus far, I only have correspondence between those branches and Moscow from the Moscow files. So I would love to branch out and kind of at some point get access to what they were up to in Ukraine.
Okay. A follow-on question from James Graham. He's curious whether whether this practice of visualization how it fits in with language policies of the nationalities policy, and how it sort of ties in with perhaps a a prelude to increased Russification, or again, is it how does it tie in sort of a the conflict between focusing on internationalism, nationalities versus Russification?
Right, absolutely. So most of the most, as far as I know, most of the surviving Isostat books, and of course, I'm bringing in books here because these are the things that have survived. Isostat produced all kinds of posters and pamphlets and things that I have not yet seen, most of which I have not yet seen, right? And so it's just a question of kind of what survives. But most of the books, of course, are Russian language or English, and then there's some other foreign languages as well. Where one way of answering your question, perhaps, is to bring in the Ukrainian branch. And you can see by 1936, 1937, that there are tensions between Moscow wanting to kind of bring the Ukrainian branch under its auspices, and the Ukrainian branch saying, no, we can't do that because we work in the Ukrainian language and you will not understand what Ukrainian viewers are interested in seeing and how to kind of work in that language. And so there's some real tensions that emerge there. That's the only kind of place that I can see that so far. But I think that, all these questions are really onto something. And this is certainly my next avenue for research, is to pay much more attention to language policy, nationalities policy, and how this connects to that. So thank you for that question.
Great. A question from Karen Fox, who spent time researching at in the Lenin Library as well as in St. Petersburg, looking at Soviet-era health posters, wonders whether you can see the use of the Vienna Method in other areas, such as health posters, or perhaps other facets of Soviet governance, beyond economic growth and communicating, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you so much. And this is, of course, the health, pedagogy and the spread of information about hygiene and health is a large segment of what kind of Isotype does globally, when it kind of goes beyond the Soviet Union into other areas of the world. And so I was expecting to find this theme much more prominently in Isostat's work, but I haven't found it as much. But I do know that prior to the creation of Isostat, in the early 1920s, the first Soviet statistical agency, before it was reorganized a decade later, the first Soviet statistical agency did have a graphic office, a very small one. And they, as far as I can tell from archival files, mostly worked on health-related or hygiene-related exhibitions for the population. And so that, I think, was an early concern. Why I'm not seeing it in Isostat's graphics, I don't know. I really expected to find more. So thanks, Karen, for that question.
Okay. Peter Rutland chimes in with another question, asking your evaluation of the originality or aesthetic level of these Isostat charts compared to Nairath's work. Do they appear a bit mechanical and repetitive to you, or is that just a feature, not a bug? Is it the mechanical repetitive nature sort of part of the point of being very understandable to the viewer's eye?
Yes, I think it is. I think the repetitive nature is sort of built into this idea of creating a language that is comprehensible and that, has a sort of dictionary, right, that you kind of draw from and that everybody will understand and know. But in terms of the artistic value of these, I mean, if we look at some of these larger books that were extremely expensive to make, and you can see, Isostat managers complaining about the expense of the books that they're creating in 1936 and 1938 in archival files. But those books are beautiful, like they're incredible. There's incredible artistry and creativity worked into those, and those are the books that kind of bring in Rodchenko and Stepanova and Lisitsky as well is involved. And so I think that in terms of artistry, we can find it here. But in some cases, some of the images do tend to look, not as artistic, a little bit more shoddy and sort of, boring, not as beautiful, I suppose, in terms of an aesthetic judgment.
Great. Well, I want to close on the question of how would you bring your research on past government communication to the Russian people and international audiences, very much part of it, to the present? What influences do you see in today's media outreach by the Russian state? Or contrastly, what radical departures do you see from past practice?
Well, some of the work that that Andrew, my intern, Andrew Liflianchik, was doing for me and that we were doing in the spring had to do with looking at data visualization and infographics used on a website called DNR Live. And that website has since gone down, at least as far as I can see it. I'm sure it's still live, but it's sort of blocked from my viewing. I took some screenshots, thankfully. DNR Live, of course, Donetsk People's Republic Live. A website, it's unclear to me, it was moved onto Russian servers shortly after February 24th. It's unclear to me exactly who runs it or who started it, but that website is absolutely full of infographics, including Vienna Method infographics used in this as well, but a real mishmash of different methods to communicate very basic information to citizens in Donetsk about the new government that had come into being since 2014 and government agencies that they would need to know about. And so I think we can actually see, this continue into the present in major ways. And the use of this as an imperial tool is something that I think, now I'm turning back to this historical case in the 1930s and sort of taking lessons from that and bringing it back into the 1930s to kind of draw those parallels. So I think that, we can absolutely see this. Data visualization is used all over the world as a way to kind of compel and convince citizenry. But in imperial contexts, it becomes especially powerful, I think, and interesting, especially when it's conveying really crucial information that people do need to know for their daily lives. So sadly, that's a sort of sad current present day parallel to what I'm looking at in the 30s.
I will also add to that the slide that you had of the Soviet soldier picking up the child, presumably the Polish child, you see that in lots of sort of street art, murals, official murals of the Russian soldier picking up the Ukrainian child in today's war. And I'm sure that if you did a quick search, you would find the same from World War II, of the Russian soldier saving recaptured lands or East European lands. So some things are classic. And the classics sustain over time, I think.
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Well, I think with that, we'll bring the session to a close. I want to thank the audience for tuning in. And if you can't get enough of this, please be aware that it'll be up for rebroadcast later on. So if you missed anything, please do tune in and restream. But I encourage you all once again to check out the Kennan Institute social media and our various pods and blogs and podcasts. And thank you again for attending. And Catherine, thanks to you for a fascinating presentation. We're really fortunate to have you as a Billington Fellow.
My pleasure. Thank you.